So much for the tolerant left.
Then he got fired for that, and then he got fired for that, but he did that, and then he did that, but then she didn't, and then he got called out, but then he didn't get fired, but he did that, but then he's still there, and then he got fired, but then he got fired despite the fact that he did this, but he didn't.
The offensive attitudes and statements discovered on James's Twitter feed are indefensible and inconsistent with our studio's values, and we have severed our business relationship with him. If you've been keeping up with the latest social media furor, you might recognize this as the statement given by Disney Studios chairman Alan Horn, talking about the company's decision to fire Guardians of the Galaxy franchise director James Gunn over some controversial posts he'd made on Twitter. If you haven't, you're in for a treat, or should I say, tweet. On July 19th, 2018, a collection of old tweets from Gunn had resurfaced, most of which date from between 2008 and 2010, with a handful as recently as 2012. In them, Gunn employs some particularly racy humour, focusing on the topics of rape, molestation, and paedophilia, generally considered to be some of the most difficult topics to discuss in a comedic manner, if, indeed, you even think they should ever be topics utilised for the purpose of comedy. Examples of these tweets include: I'm doing a big Hollywood film adaptation of The Giving Tree with a happy ending. The tree grows back and gives the kid a blowjob. The Hardy Boys and the mystery of what it feels like when Uncle Bernie fists me. Watching Trapped in the Closet, R. Kelly's second best video after the one where he urinates on a child. And... man, I should stop reading these out loud. Alongside these tweets, some blog posts were also found, in which Gunn humorously recounts a story he'd heard about the monkey co-star of kids' movie Max Keeble's Big Move masturbating on set directly onto a child. A story which, in his own words, may have been sick, but made him extremely happy. There were other tweets, and in the name of not being accused of biased reporting, I'm going to link as many as possible in the description, though also in the name of brevity, I won't list them all here. Needless to say, considering Gunn is now most famously known as the director of a Marvel superhero film series targeted towards kids and teenagers, a whole lot of emotional drama and hot takes would soon follow. Defenders of Gunn were quick to point out that the majority of these tweets had been pulled up from now almost a decade ago, and it emerged that Gunn had actually already apologised in 2012 for his controversial jokes online. Full disclosure, the apologies I've found only cover his blog posts and not his Twitter, though it's also important to remember Twitter has only really been seen as this unique social media platform in the last few years. In any case, detractors were keen to point out the sheer number of jokes Gunn had made on this topic, with initial caller-outer Mike Cernovich clarifying, James Gunn didn't make a joke, he posted over and over and over. It was a pattern of behaviour. An interesting response from an interesting fellow. All of this ramped up until, as I mentioned earlier, a speedy response emerged from the higher-ups at Disney. Gunn was out, cited for inconsistency with the values of the company. So that's the broad strokes, but what does it really tell us? Well, the response to Disney's announcement that they'd be outing Gunn certainly tells us that there's really no consensus on who is or isn't in the right here, or even why one side is right or the other.
I mean, it's a tough one,
It's all very vague in terms of the who's and whys of this apparent stepping over of the line. If any of you checked out my Plane Bay video a couple of weeks ago, you know what that means. Like before, it feels like there's this kind of weird inconsistency with the way that society processes certain events, and I feel like putting that under the microscope. I'm gonna keep stripping down certain aspects of this situation, getting rid of the fluff of the various debates around the issue. Maybe then, finally, we can work out what we collectively believe and why. Generally, people fall into a few different camps. For some, Gunn's tweets were merely jokes gone wrong, and they don't see it as fair to rob a man of his job over it. Some, while acknowledging Gunn's tweets were pretty puerile, still feel it's wrong to punish someone who has clearly and repeatedly repented for the jokes and has not repeated that behaviour in nearly a decade. Some think Disney is well within their rights to out an employee so blatantly contradicting their own company values. To which others responded, hey, only now is he against their company values? What about Tromeo? To which I said, yeah, Tromeo. And then I said, what's Tromeo? In the name of understanding the situation as much as possible, I decided to check out James Gunn's first cinematic production, 1996's Tromeo and Juliet.
You horny little cow. Probably dreaming of getting fucked in the ass.
Oh no.
Care for someone.
Oh no. Oh no.
Kill you.
Oh,
I'm going to
no.
kill you and fuck you at the same time.
A rough adaptation of Shakespeare's classic play, Romeo and Juliet is a crude, lewd black comedy featuring grotesque violence, potty humour, gratuitous sex scenes, and incestuous rape. If you're familiar with production company Troma Entertainment, it's pretty standard fare from them. If you're not, which admittedly I wasn't in more than passing, they're an independent company founded in 1974 that mostly deals in these kinds of trashy B-movie schlock. A company without much care at all for toning down its content for general audiences. Its alumni include Trey Parker and Matt Stone, creators of South Park, if that's any indication of their content. James Gunn is only listed as the writer of Tromeo, but recounts from production staff have made it clear that he played a far larger role in the film, which he apparently saw at the time as his first big break. It was, ultimately, the first in what would be a long line of often risque productions on his part. PG Porn, a web series Gunn would later write and produce, was a series of online skits satirizing the often stilted writing and performances of pornographic videos.
Penis?
My penis? Why would I use my penis to work on your car?
I thought we were double entendres.
My penis is mushy. That would be very painful.
Dark comedy Super, the only film I'd personally been familiar with before I saw Guardians, and the last one Gunn directed before being hired by Disney, is the story of a schizophrenic shut-in who decides to become a real-life superhero. After receiving an epiphany from God, he assumes the identity of the Crimson Bolt, dressing up in a skin-tight suit and going out to shut up crime. He does so with the help of a giant wrench, which he uses to smash over the heads of drug dealers, child molesters, petty thieves, and people that cut in line. Oh yeah, and at one point in the movie, he's comedically raped by his perverted sidekick, Balti. The reason I bring all of this up is because I think it clarifies at least some of the societal disconnect that seems to plague the many disagreements about Gunn's firing. Namely, the disconnect between those that are actually familiar with Gunn's previous work and those that only understand him as the director of the Guardians movies. If you aren't, well, that prior statement by Disney claiming that they'd only now learned that he'd been offensive in the past and therefore does not represent their values can ring pretty true. If you are, you're probably thinking, did Disney really not think to even look at the previous work of the guy they were hiring to direct a multi-million-dollar movie as part of a massive cinematic universe? No. It's hard not to see Disney's action in a pretty different light with that in mind. One that maybe forces us to re-examine exactly what was motivating Disney's position. Because, I mean, is it moral consistency? Well... On the 23rd, actor and director Bobcat Goldthwait, who had played the minion Pain in the Disney film Hercules, released his own statement in defense of Gunn. Specifically, in light of the fact that he'd recently reprised his role for a new Disney ride, he asked the company to strip his voice from the attraction, citing his own fairly public past of extremely provocative and kid-unfriendly content. His own films, for instance, include black comedies Sleeping Dogs Lie, about a woman who committed bestiality on a dog, and World's Greatest Dad, in which a porn-obsessed 14-year-old dies of autoerotic asphyxiation, with his father impersonating him for personal gain. On a more personal note, Goldthwait was also a famously controversial talk show guest, having in the past lit props on fire and thrown furniture into the audience. All of this added up to his confusion that he would be considered acceptable and not James Gunn, and this did not end there. Goldthwait also pointed out Disney's continued working relationship with James Woods, the voice of Hades, in light of his own social media activity. Woods had, among other things, had an altercation with another user who referred to him as a cocaine addict, who he then pushed to sue before making a mockery of the fact that said user had died before the suit could go ahead. Woods, also vocally anti-LGBT, had also responded to an image of parents supporting their transgender child by tweeting, "This is sweet, wait until this poor kid grows up, realizes what you've done, and stuffs both of you dismembered into a freezer." To top it off, Woods has also been accused by multiple women of sexual misconduct in the wake of the #MeToo campaign. Yet, still, Woods works alongside Disney. Of course, perhaps none of this is inconsistent because Disney might have a very particular policy about the topic of paedophilia, even in the context of a joke. To which we then might look at Sarah Silverman, the star of the upcoming Wreck-It Ralph 2, who also made a racy joke about being a paedophile at around the same time Gunn did. And this does not only go as far as jokes. As Bobcat concluded in his statement, Disney's role in financing the film Powder, a film directed by a man who was even by then convicted of filming himself molesting a 12-year-old, certainly points to some further inconsistencies in their values. So, what? Did I just do all that to come to a fairly obvious conclusion? Disney fires people not based on any consistent values, but on a rough metric of how much outrage surrounds the incident versus how much they stand to lose by removing them. That's right, one of the largest media conglomerates in the world bases its decisions largely on capital. Just like down there, my Patreon also is just... All jokes aside, as I said earlier, the general structure I've got going here is to keep stripping down more of the situation, to hopefully get to the root of the problem, and the fact remains that plenty of people in the conversation here do genuinely believe that when they support Disney's decision, they're supporting a moral decision. As should be abundantly clear by now, they didn't. They made a financial decision based on discerning the level of vocal outrage around the situation. So where do we go from here? Well, if I just proved that the moral argument on Disney's part was weak, maybe there's a different kind of consistency here, one that many people seem to be pointing to as a justification for all of this going down. A justification that, even if it goes against their core beliefs which they constantly talk about holding, allows these people to sidestep any actual need to engage with the nuances of this conversation. What if, that's right, this is all consistent with call-out culture? Even among those who, on a surface level, usually disagree with this kind of thing, have kind of defended the firing by saying this is consistent with the culture of outrage that's been generated by the left online. It's like, take that, liberals. As popular radical centrist Boogie298 puts it, regardless of how you feel about the James Gunn situation, here is some truth. This is the world we have created. We have weaponized social media and outrage culture. It's a literal culture war now. This is the exact thing I preached against. So the question is this the culture established by the social justice crowd? Is a belief that James Gunn should not have been fired inconsistent with the discourse that's already been established in those communities? Yes, you might say. Just look at Roseanne and Donald Trump. They got in trouble just for making jokes too. Well, as both are by far the two most common examples I've seen of call-out culture condemnation and how Gunn's firing is consistent with it, I think those would be the most valuable to take apart a little bit. Roseanne Barr is a conservative actress most famous for her self-named show, cancelled shortly following the initial run of its reboot after over a decade. The reason for this firing was another social media meltdown over a risque joke Roseanne had made. So far, sounds pretty similar. Now, some additional input. 1. Context. The joke Roseanne had made was not one she had made a decade ago, let alone one she'd made a decade ago and then later apologised for and has not repeated since, but one she had made just a few days before her cancellation. There was no time span in which she had cooled off or demonstrated change. As far as anyone was aware, this was who she currently was. 2. Content. Roseanne's joke, in which she referred to a black senator as if Muslim Brotherhood and Planet of the Apes had a baby, is one which specifically targeted a person on the basis of their race. It was far from a good look for somebody who'd already often been accused of racial bias, having been a strong supporter of Donald Trump despite his claims, among other things, that Mexican immigrants were mostly comprised of rapists and criminals, that a judge could not be unbiased due to his Mexican heritage, and a call for discriminatory ban on all Muslims entering the US. Speaking of Trump, another thing that often comes up when people defend Gunn is the supposed double standard of doing so while condemning Trump for similar jokes he had made decades ago. Well, for one thing, Trump's history of provocative language is not one you need to reach back a decade for. He was mocking the families of dead veterans, making fun of the disabled, and being as deliberately inflammatory as possible right through his campaign. For another, Trump has actual victims tied to his comments. His "grab 'em by the pussy" comment comes with it dozens upon dozens of individuals who have come forward claiming that the man had sexually assaulted them over the last 20 years. A far cry from the reaction James Gunn's controversy had, which has so far amounted to close friends saying, yeah, he used to be pretty edgy. Finally, maybe the President of the United States should be held to greater scrutiny than a film director? I don't know. In any case, myriad nuances exist to underline that, in fact, this is a markedly different form of outrage than that which we've seen in these cases. Perhaps nuance worthy of discussing without a blanket statement that the left simply can't take what it dishes out. Apparently, it was missed when markedly left-of-centre individuals like Al Franken, Aziz Ansari, and Leonard Dunham were all widely criticised by the left. Which brings us, finally, to a much darker point of this discussion. What if a huge part of those attempting to condemn Gunn are not doing so in the name of consistency? What if there are a great many people out there who do not think Gunn should be denounced in the name of a moral fairness, or even fairness in the eyes of outrage culture? In fact, what if there are those deliberately eliminating the necessary nuance to this conversation, all in the name of destroying any integrity left to the notion of calling someone out for a negative action? What if there are people weaponizing social media, as Boogie put it, except it's not all sides, but particular groups hoping to game the system? What if there are people doing this on purpose, in the name of bad faith? And what if that starts with the man who started this campaign? There are a segment of you who have made it to this point while thinking Gunn was right to be fired for a very simple reason. Making jokes based on those topics is never okay in any context and can never be forgiven. To be honest, that's probably the most honest and consistent position I've seen so far on the subject. Like, if you genuinely believe that rape and paedophilia should never be topics of humour, then I can't see why you wouldn't want Gunn to be punished in some ways, even if at this point the man himself would probably agree with you. The issue, however, is the sheer number of people out there who claim to be standing from this position, but in fact seem to be hiding a secret agenda. Something seems amiss, as a near 50-50 split seems to be occurring as far as the validity of Gunn's firing, while the never okay crowd, albeit sizable, do not seem to make out such a substantial number. In short, that question. Do we, as a society, accept that jokes about rape and paedophilia are never okay? Well, let's take a look at some of the most lauded comedians of the era.
Oh, they're out of control. We need prayer in the schools. We don't need prayer in schools. We need to toss salad man in school. That was straighten the kids out. Hey, Jimmy, you got a D. You know what you got to do? No!
Why is there an app for everything except how to rape a baby? Jesus.
They will be up in their rooms playing violent video games and catfishing pedophiles. These are my children.
He took my dress off. Oh God, what happened next? He took his thing out. Oh God, I don't even know what happened. Nothing, that was it. Oh, we'll make something up.
I sent a message saying what's up, then I saw she was 16. I sent another message saying, never mind. You combine those into one message, making me look like a regretful pedophile. This is the third message. It is right here, goodbye forever, or goodbye for 2 years. Scouting.
That show To Catch a Predator, man, that is horrible PR for white people, huh? Jesus Christ. Can they move that show to an urban area every once in a while? Just catch a couple of R. Kelly's peeing on some kids, you know? Just balance it out.
Don't you hate it when that happens? Yeah. Thank you, that's called beating off in A minor. Yes.
One lady said, Louis C.K. masturbating in front of me ruined my comedy dreams. Word? Well, then I dare say, madam, you may have never had a dream.
Catholic kids are stupid. They don't know how to handle a pedophile priest.
Whether we agree with it or not, it seems readily apparent that the notion that those jokes are never okay is far from a societal standard, not nearly matching the pearl-clutching outcry we've seen from the Gunn incident. And you know how I know people are being dishonest about this? Well, how about because the person who set off this whole outing campaign, whose fanbase initially spread this all around, is an accused rapist, a convicted batterer, who has made repeated jokes centered around rape. Mike Cernovich is a far-right political pundit who, in fact, specializes in this kind of call-out principle, pumping out of context, overblown, and even outright false information and quotes from various opponents he disagrees with politically, in the hopes of utilizing call-out culture to have them deplatformed. If any of you remember far back to the old days of 2016, Cernovich was the man who first instigated the Pizzagate conspiracy, which theorized a massive secret pedophile ring between the Democratic Party with the use of various secret coded messages. And yes, James Gunn too was linked to this conspiracy by holding a pizza in a picture. This conspiracy ended with a man running into a pizza place with a loaded gun, demanding to go to the basement and confront the Democrat pedophiles down below, not realizing that, in fact, that pizza place didn't even have a basement. But yes, the pedophile accusation has continued to be a staple of Cernovich's heavy sarcasm reporting against people who just so happen to be arguing with him at the time. Sam Cedar, left-wing radio host, was targeted, with Cernovich deliberately taking a tweet from Cedar mocking supporters of child molesting director Roman Polanski and sending it out to employers and sponsors out of context while insisting that Cedar was actually supporting Polanski. Vic Berger, videographer, was targeted. Michael Ian Black, comedian, was targeted. James Gunn ultimately was targeted. Cernovich's dishonest reporting was only the start of this, but it's brought with it many mistruths and outright lies even to those genuinely upset with what Gunn did. The 10,000 tweets number is often cited, with the claim that James Gunn had deleted 10,000 tweets following his outing, and therefore he'd made 10,000 rape and paedophilia jokes on his social media. I mean, I did do the maths on this one, and that would be like multiple rape and paedophilia jokes every single day for the last 10 years. Like, I just think it's a little bit unlikely. But this hasn't stopped people being called outright paedophile apologists for clarifying that fact. Cernovich even made sure to blur out a link to little girls touching themselves that Gunn had apparently left, leaving out the fact that the Rickroll style link was to a music video titled I Touch Myself to make Gunn appear to actually be spreading child porn. Even if all of this clearly twisted reporting wasn't there, it would still be obvious what Cernovich was doing merely by virtue of the fact that he was arguably one of the most fervent supporters online of Republican Senator Roy Moore. You know, Roy Moore, who was accused by 9 women of sexual assault, some as young as 16, one as young as 14? Ah yes, this is definitely a man who cares about people minimizing sexual misdeeds. The grand trick of this routine is that once people figure it out, that's when it works. Because it isn't ultimately just the intention of Cernovich and his MAGA crowd to use false reporting to destroy people they disagree with. The end goal here is to destroy the very notion of a justified call-out. And hence we get to the community of free speech skeptics in the centre, those that are either indifferent to what they see as a consistent culture of outrage, or who would claim outright that it's all the same no matter what side you're on. Well, as I've hopefully illustrated up to this point, it really isn't. In making false equivalencies like those I've highlighted above, in trying to disguise or outright fabricate details I've been talking about all this time, there is one singular idea Mike Cernovich and his ilk are attempting to spread here, an idea that's penetrating our cultural space, an idea that, in my mind, defines this societal inconsistency I've been building up to all along. It's all the same. A person who made a joke 10 years prior and apologized for it is not the same as a person who makes hateful attacks to this day. A person who has victims to his name is not the same as a person who does not. A person who makes jokes about paedophilia is not the same as a paedophile. All of these come loaded with nuances that can be frustrating and can be difficult to wrap our heads around at times, but we need to understand them. This isn't about defending some rich white guy who will obviously be fine, and like, Disney as a company has the right to do what they want to do, even if I disagree with the idea of them doing it, or that they should even have this kind of power. It's about the fact that this road goes one of two ways if we allow people like Cernovich to control the public narrative. On the one hand, call-out culture is eradicated completely, rendered invalid through the sheer level of mistrust people have with the claims. I'm sure to some this would be an absolute delight. Now you can be as racist, misogynist, hateful, abusive, you can actually be a rapist and suffer no consequences. The other road is an even darker one which paradoxically could most target the marginalised groups only now getting a shot at mainstream success. If all it takes is a few dug up, out of context messages and maybe a smattering of outright lies, what happens to women, LGBT, or people of colour that the bigoted among us would rather see fall out of the spotlight? If the system is reprogrammed to work this way, companies like Disney, most concerned with financial stability, are certainly not going to rock the boat. I've hopefully made that evident with the dishonest way they've handled this event. And if the centrist pundits who should be attacking this kind of thing shrug their shoulders and say, reap what you sow, both sides lie, that's when we have some serious problems. Even when you do wish to call out people like Gunn, it becomes small potatoes compared to those increasingly marginalised groups mysteriously having decades-old histories resurfaced and spruced up to serve a monstrous and manipulative narrative. I'm not here to explain to you why James Gunn is actually a great guy who you're wrong to not be okay with. I'd actually originally planned a segment here all about Gunn's redemption arc, about how, as illustrated by his brother Sean, his work with Guardians epitomises his own personal journey. How he, once a fairly bitter and indifferent person, has learned to really care about what he's saying. As Star-Lord himself puts it, to give a shit. But that's not the point, and not really my intention. My intention is purely to illustrate the many manufactured aspects of this story that appear to point to some particularly seedy motivations which, again, could ultimately serve to eventually harm the most marginalized among the mainstream. If I had any request, it would be this. Know your sources, respect the nuances of these situations, and always look a little bit deeper, because as should be clear here, there are increasing numbers of parties that explicitly want you to be complacent about this call-out business. So don't let them. Don't let them tell you it's all or none. Don't let them say it's all equal. Don't run with their lies simply because you feel you should. Letting people like Cernovich control the narrative is as simple as doing nothing at all. Hiya, thanks so much for watching and for hearing me out for as long as this thing has gone on. Even if you wind up disagreeing with me on some aspects of this story, I hope you got something out of this. It's a developing narrative, and as I hope I've made clear, there's a lot of misinformation floating around, so it's hard to really have one definitive perspective. Anything you think I've gotten wrong or simply want to chat about, please let me know in the comments. I'd also like to make a special thanks to Patreon supporters Owen Maitzen, Peter Coffin, and Nichtschwert? Is that right? I feel like that isn't right. Sorry, buddy. If you'd like to also support these weekly think pieces, please consider throwing a buck or two because it really helps justify the time investment. I think next week we've got a Fallout video, unless another hot news topic comes out. We'll see. Also, let me underline that special thanks to Peter Coffin because I don't think I would have seen this recent bump in audience without his help spreading it around. And you can help too. Sharing me around on Twitter and Reddit and stuff like that could make or break this channel, so obviously that'd be hugely appreciated. And if you can't donate to the Patreon, stuff like that or liking the video also helps me out. In any case, thanks again for watching and have a fantastic weekend.